It is 7 o'clock in the morning on Friday, December 5th, 1952, and London is waking up to another winter day. In Bethnal Green, a milkman makes his rounds, glass bottles clinking in wire crates. In Kensington, a mother bundles her children into their school coats. In the city, clerks in dark suits and bowler hats stream from the underground stations toward their offices. The war has been over for 7 years. Britain is rebuilding. London is alive. The morning is cold. Temperatures hover just above freezing. There is fog, the kind London is famous for, the kind Londoners have lived with for generations. Thick, yellow-gray fog that smells faintly of coal smoke. Nothing unusual. Nothing alarming. By nightfall, visibility will be measured in feet, not miles. Within 3 days, hospitals will be overwhelmed. Within 5 days, more than 4,000 people will be dead, killed not by violence, not by disease in the ordinary sense, but by the air itself. And the British government will tell its citizens that the smog is fog, that the deaths are coincidence, that there is nothing to be alarmed about, that they should stay calm and carry on. It will take 4 years and the deaths of thousands more before anything changes. To understand what happened in London in December 1952, you need to understand 3 things: coal, weather, and the geography of a city built in a river valley. London sits in the Thames River basin. The city is surrounded by low hills. Under certain weather conditions, cold air becomes trapped in the valley beneath a layer of warmer air above. A phenomenon meteorologists call a temperature inversion. Under normal conditions, warm air rises and carries pollution upward and away. Under an inversion, pollution has nowhere to go. It accumulates, it thickens, it sits over the city like a lid on a pot. In December 1952, Britain was burning coal at a scale unprecedented in peacetime. The war had ended, but rationing had not. Homes, factories, power stations all ran on coal, and not the best coal. The finest British coal was being exported to raise foreign currency to rebuild the country's shattered economy. What was left for British homes was a cheap, dirty, high-sulfur coal the coal board called nutty slack. It burned poorly. It smoked heavily. It was what you burned when you had no other choice. An average London home burned coal in an open fireplace. An average London power station, and there were 4 major ones inside the city limits: Battersea, Bankside, Kingston, and Fulham, burned coal to generate electricity. An average London factory burned coal to run its machinery. When you added it all together, 8 million people in their industries were burning millions of tons of low-grade coal simultaneously across a city surrounded by hills. And in the background, a detail that made everything worse: London was in the middle of a cold snap. Temperatures had dropped sharply in the final days of November. Every fireplace in every home was burning harder than usual. Every power station was running flat out to meet the demand for heat and light. On December 4th, a high-pressure system settled over southern England. The air went still. The wind died. The temperature inversion formed. A ceiling of warm air at about 150 feet above the ground, trapping everything beneath it. And the city of 8 million people kept burning coal. The men responsible for what happened in London in December 1952 were not invisible. They were among the most powerful men in Britain. Winston Churchill, 78 years old, Prime Minister for the second time. The man who had led Britain through the war, re-elected in October 1951 on a promise of prosperity and recovery. A man whose political philosophy was defined by decisive action in moments of crisis. In December 1952, presented with a public health emergency unfolding in real time across his own capital, he made the decision that this was not a crisis. It was weather. Weather was not a political problem. Ian MacLeod, 39 years old, newly appointed Minister of Health, just 5 months into the job, bright, ambitious, politically sharp, the man directly responsible for Britain's public health response. When doctors began reporting a surge in respiratory deaths, MacLeod's ministry issued statements that the deaths were within normal seasonal variation for the time of year. When asked directly in Parliament about the smog, he replied, quote, "We do not seem to have had as many people dying as we thought at first. That statement was a lie." The Ministry of Health had been receiving real-time mortality reports from London hospitals and from the General Register Office since the second day of the smog. MacLeod knew the death toll. He chose to publicly minimize it, and behind them both, the National Coal Board and the British coal industry. An industry that employed nearly 700,000 men, an industry that powered the entire British economy. An industry that, when scientists began suggesting that coal smoke might be killing people at scale, responded not with concern, but with a campaign to cast doubt on the science, delay regulation, and protect profits. Friday, December 5th. Morning. The fog is thick when Londoners wake. Visibility is down to a few hundred yards in places. Traffic slows. Pedestrians walk carefully. The air smells of sulfur, coal smoke mixed with moisture. But this is London in winter. This is normal. By afternoon, the fog has thickened. Visibility in central London drops to 50 yards. Bus conductors walk in front of their buses carrying lanterns, guiding drivers who can no longer see the road. The underground is packed, people abandoning surface transport for the tunnels below. By evening, visibility is measured in feet. In some parts of the city you cannot see your hand in front of your face. The smog is yellow-brown, thick enough to taste. It burns the throat. It stings the eyes. At Sadler's Wells Theatre, a performance of La Traviata is halted halfway through the first act. The smog has seeped inside the building. The audience can no longer see the stage. At Smithfield Show, the country's largest livestock exhibition, cattle begin to collapse in their stalls. Veterinarians arrive with oxygen tanks. Some of the prize animals die before morning. Their lungs, like the lungs of the people in the streets outside, cannot process what is in the air. Saturday, December 6th. The smog is worse. Visibility in central London is now down to a yard in places. Ambulances navigate by following the curb. Buses are abandoned where they stand when their drivers can no longer see. Criminals take advantage of the cover. The Metropolitan Police record a surge in street robberies, purse snatchings, and burglaries. Hospitals report a surge in admissions, respiratory distress, heart attacks, people collapsing in the street. The very young and the very old are hit hardest. Infants with undeveloped lungs, elderly people with chronic bronchitis. The Ministry of Health issues no warnings. The BBC broadcasts no health advisories. The official position is that this is fog, and fog is a natural phenomenon that will clear when the weather changes. Sunday, December 7th. 3 days in. The smog has not lifted. Hospitals are overwhelmed. Mortuaries are full. Undertakers are running out of coffins. In the East End, Bethnal Green, Stepney, Poplar, where coal burning is heaviest and housing is poorest, people are dying in their homes. Doctors make house calls and find entire families struggling to breathe, their homes filled with smog that has seeped through every crack and gap in the brickwork. Monday, December 8th, 4 days. The death toll is accelerating. In Parliament, the Labour MP Tom Williams rises to ask if the government has any comment on the fog and the deaths being reported. The Minister of Health's reply, in full, "I cannot make a statement on the matter." That is the entire official government acknowledgement 4 days into the worst public health disaster in modern British history. By this point, florists in central London are reporting unprecedented orders for funeral wreaths. Train services are suspended. The entire country's transportation network centered on London has ground to a halt. Tuesday, December 9th. 5 days. The weather changes. A breeze picks up from the west. The temperature inversion breaks. The warm air ceiling lifts. The smog begins to disperse. By evening, you can see across the street again. By the next morning, visibility is nearly normal. The smog is gone. The deaths are not. The smog killed in ways that were not immediately visible. There was no explosion, no fire, no collapse. People simply stopped breathing. The particulate matter in the smog, tiny particles of soot, ash, and unburned coal, was small enough to pass deep into the lungs, into the alveoli where oxygen enters the blood. Once there, it blocked oxygen exchange. The body began to suffocate from the inside. The sulfur dioxide, a gas produced when high sulfur coal burns, reacted with moisture in the lungs to form sulfuric acid. Breathing the smog was, at a chemical level, like breathing a weak acid mist. The throat burned, the lungs blistered. Mucus production went into overdrive, clogging airways already compromised by the particulate matter. For people with pre-existing respiratory or heart conditions, the smog was a death sentence. For infants, whose lungs were still developing, it was catastrophic. For the elderly, whose lungs had been weakened by decades of breathing coal smoke in a city with no pollution controls of any kind, it was the final insult to systems already on the edge of failure. Doctors who treated patients during the smog described symptoms they had never seen in such concentration. Cyanosis, the skin turning blue from oxygen deprivation, pulmonary edema, the lungs filling with fluid, patients drowning in their own secretions, unable to cough them up. One hospital registrar in Bethnal Green later wrote that by the third day, he had stopped being able to clear the beds fast enough. Patients were dying on gurneys in the corridors before he could admit them to the wards. And then there were the deaths that were not counted as smog deaths. The man who had a heart attack because his heart, already weak, could not cope with the oxygen deprivation. The infant who died of pneumonia that would not have developed if the smog had not first damaged her lungs. The elderly woman who fell down her own stairs because she could not see through the smog that had seeped into her home. The official Ministry of Health figure, released weeks later, was 4,000 deaths directly attributable to the smog. That was the number the British government stood by for 40 years. Modern epidemiological analysis, using statistical modeling of excess deaths in the weeks following the smog, puts the true toll between 10,000 and 12,000. That is more than Britain lost in the entire Blitz of 1940. That is more than the United States lost in the September 11th attacks. While people were dying in their homes and in hospital corridors, the British government was making a different kind of decision. The decision was not whether to act. The decision was whether to admit that anything unusual was happening at all. Cabinet papers from December 1952, declassified in the 1980s, show that ministers were receiving real-time mortality updates from the Ministry of Health from the second day of the smog onward. They knew the death toll was running at 4 times the seasonal average. They knew hospitals were overwhelmed. They knew mortuaries had run out of space. They said nothing. The reason was political. Britain in 1952 was a country still recovering from the war, still under rationing, still broke. The coal industry was the spine of the economy. Admitting that coal smoke was killing people in the thousands would have required action, pollution controls, smokeless fuel mandates, regulations on industry, all of which would cost money the government did not have and threaten jobs in an industry that employed nearly 1 million people. Worse, from the Churchill government's perspective, acknowledging the smog as a public health catastrophe would have been politically humiliating. The Conservatives had won the 1951 election, promising recovery and prosperity. A mass casualty event in the nation's capital, caused by the fuel the government had designated for public use, was not a story the government wanted to tell. So the decision was made: say nothing that would cause alarm. Treat it as weather. Wait for it to pass. And when the death toll could no longer be hidden, attribute it to a tragic but unavoidable natural event. The BBC, following government guidance, did not issue health warnings during the 5 days of the smog. Newspapers, following official sources, reported it as an inconvenience, not a catastrophe. The Times of December 8th ran a front-page story about transportation disruption. The deaths were relegated to a small item on page 7. The public was told to stay calm, to carry on, and to trust that the government had matters in hand. The government did not have matters in hand. The government was hoping the wind would change before anyone noticed. The official death toll was 4,000. That number is a lie. It is the lie the British government told for decades. The real death toll is unknowable with precision, but modern epidemiological analysis, first published by researchers at St. George's Hospital Medical School in 2004, puts it between 10,000 and 12,000 deaths in the 2 months following the smog. Some died during the 5 days. Some died in the weeks after, their lungs damaged beyond recovery. Some died months later, their hearts giving out under strain that would not have been fatal if the smog had not weakened them first. The deaths were not evenly distributed. The East End died first. Bethnal Green, Stepney, Poplar, Shoreditch. The working-class neighborhoods of East London, where housing was poorest, insulation was non-existent, and people burned the cheapest coal available in open fireplaces because they could not afford anything better. Mortality rates in these boroughs during the smog week were more than 8 times the seasonal average. In Kensington and Mayfair, where central heating was more common, where buildings were better insulated, where people could afford to stay indoors and stay warm without stoking their fires, mortality rates were barely elevated at all. The smog killed the poor. It left the wealthy mostly untouched. The infants died second. 800 babies and children under the age of 1 died in London during the smog week. 800. Their lungs were not developed enough to filter the particulate matter. Their immune systems were not strong enough to fight the secondary infections. Pediatric wards at Great Ormond Street and the Royal London became places where doctors triaged children in the corridors. The elderly died third. People over 65 accounted for more than half of the total excess deaths. Most had some form of pre-existing respiratory or cardiac condition. The smog did not create their diseases. It exploited them. A man who might have lived another 10 years with his chronic bronchitis died in a week because the air in his bedroom became unbreathable. Undertakers ran out of coffins. Mortuaries ran out of space. Families buried their dead and were told by the same government that had failed to warn them that the deaths were an unfortunate result of weather and pre-existing health conditions. Not a single word about coal. Not a single acknowledgement that the smog was man-made. Not a single apology. In the immediate aftermath of the smog, the British government did nothing. No emergency regulations, no bans on coal burning during inversions, no public health campaigns. Nothing. Public pressure, driven largely by the Manchester Guardian, the Daily Mirror, and a handful of public health doctors who broke ranks and went to the press, eventually forced the government to establish a committee of inquiry. The Beaver Committee, chaired by industrialist Hugh Beaver, was convened in 1953 to investigate the causes of the smog. That committee took 2 years to report. Its findings, published in 1954, confirmed what public health experts had been saying for decades. Coal smoke was a major contributor to air pollution, and air pollution was killing people at scale. The report recommended legislation to control coal burning in urban areas, the establishment of smokeless zones in cities, and the gradual transition to cleaner fuels. The coal industry lobbied against all of it. The National Coal Board argued that the science was inconclusive. Industry groups claimed that regulation would destroy jobs, cripple the economy, and leave working-class families unable to heat their homes. The government delayed. In the winter of 1955 to 1956, another smog descended on London. Another 1,000 people died. The public pressure became unignorable. Finally, in 1956, 4 years after the Great Smog, and only after additional smog events had killed thousands more, Parliament passed the Clean Air Act. The act established smokeless zones in urban areas, required the use of cleaner fuels in designated areas, and gave local authorities the power to regulate industrial emissions. It was the first major air pollution legislation in British history. Ian MacLeod, the Minister of Health who had told Parliament that the death toll was nothing unusual, was promoted. He went on to become Chancellor of the Exchequer. He died in 1970, having never publicly acknowledged that his statements during the smog had been untrue. Winston Churchill continued as Prime Minister until his resignation in 1955. He made no public statement about the smog during the remainder of his time in office. His memoirs, published over the following decade, do not mention it. The families of the 12,000 dead received no compensation, no inquiry, no apology. They received the Clean Air Act, 4 years late. They were told by their government that their loved ones had died of unfortunate weather, and that was the end of it. The Clean Air Act of 1956 worked. Within a decade, London's air quality improved dramatically. The coal-burning open fireplaces that had defined London life for 2 centuries were phased out. Smokeless zones expanded. The yellow-gray smogs that had been a winter constant became rare, then vanished entirely. By the 1970s, London was a different city. You could see across the Thames again. Buildings that had been black with soot for a century were cleaned, and the stone beneath was revealed to be white, cream, golden Portland stone. The London particular, the thick yellow fog romanticized in Dickens, in Conan Doyle, in Victorian literature, was gone. But the cost of that transformation is still visible if you know where to look. The East End cemeteries hold the graves of the December 1952 dead. Most are marked only with names and dates. Some are marked with nothing at all. Pauper burials for families who could not afford headstones. The smog did not leave war memorials. It left unmarked plots in public cemeteries scattered across the boroughs where the poor had died at 8 times the rate of the rich. The National Archives at Kew hold the cabinet papers, declassified in the 1980s, that show what the government knew and when. The documents are dry, bureaucratic, clinical. They discuss death tolls in the language of statistical variation. They discuss political risk in the language of economic impact. They do not discuss the people who died. They do not discuss the children who watched their grandparents suffocate. They do not discuss the mothers who held infants who could not breathe. The records are there. The truth is there. But there is no national memorial, no plaque, no public acknowledgement that 12,000 people died because their government chose not to warn them. The London Great Smog of 1952 was not a natural disaster. It was a policy failure. The weather created the conditions. The coal created the poison. But the government created the catastrophe by choosing again and again not to act on warnings it had received for decades. Public health doctors had been warning about coal smoke since the 1920s. The link between air pollution and respiratory mortality was documented in the Medical Research Council's own studies as early as 1930. A 1948 incident in Donora, Pennsylvania, in which 20 people died in an industrial smog, had been studied in detail by British public health officials. The mechanism was known. The risk was known. The link between coal smoke and mass casualty was settled science in 1952. It had simply been politically inconvenient to act on it. When the smog descended on December 5th, the government had a choice. It could have warned the public. It could have closed schools. It could have suspended non-essential industry. It could have told people with respiratory conditions to stay indoors. It could have distributed masks. It could have declared a public health emergency. It chose to do none of these things. It chose silence. And when the deaths became too numerous to hide, it chose to lie about the number. It called 4,000 when the real figure was 3 times that. It called it weather. It called it pre-existing conditions. It called it anything except what it was, a mass casualty event caused by an industrial fuel policy the government had every power to change. The Clean Air Act, when it finally came, worked. That is the cruelest part of this story. The solution was known. The legislation was drafted. The political will to pass it existed. It just had to be built, slowly, over 4 more years and thousands more deaths, because no single elected official was willing to take the political cost of moving first. 12,000 people paid that cost instead. Among them, approximately 800 infants, their lungs undeveloped, their immune systems unready. Approximately 6,000 elderly Londoners, most of them working class, most of them living in housing. Their government had failed to insulate and heating with coal their government had chosen to subsidize. Approximately 2,000 working-age adults with pre-existing respiratory conditions, caused, in many cases, by decades of breathing the coal smoke that their government refused to acknowledge as a public health threat. Every time you see a news story about a government denying a public health risk to protect an industry, a tobacco industry, an opioid manufacturer, a chemical company, a fossil fuel giant, this is the same story. The facts change. The industry changes. The science changes. The structure does not.